I was sitting on a cot in a plywood transient tent at Camp Arifjan, Kuwait, holding my own signature in my hands, and I had never signed that page in my life. My name is Isabel Amaral. Most people call me Izzy. I'm a sergeant first class in the Massachusetts Army National Guard, and in the spring of 2024 I was 9 months into a deployment supporting logistics operations out of Kuwait, when my father, Joachim Amaral, died of a heart attack in the back office of the bait and tackle shop he'd run for 31 years on Pope's Island, between New Bedford and Fairhaven, Massachusetts. I didn't make it home for the funeral. My brother made all the arrangements, and 4 months after I finally did get home, I found out that the will splitting our father's estate between the two of us wasn't the will our father had actually signed. This is the story of how I proved it, without ever raising my voice, while the person who forged it was absolutely certain I never would. Our father ran Amaral Marine Supply out of a squat cinderblock building on the Fairhaven side of the harbor. The sort of place that smelled like two-cycle engine oil, wet rope and low tide no matter what time of year it was. The front windows were crowded with rust-colored buoys, crab traps stacked like wire baskets in a warehouse, and cheap neon signs for lobster bait and emergency flares. Inside, the floor always had a film of salt ground into it from boots and rubber soles, and the register drawer stuck just enough that you had to know the trick to open it without embarrassing yourself in front of a customer. My father bought the building in 1993 with money he saved after 20 years of working the boats out of New Bedford, back when the docks still had more Portuguese being spoken than English. He'd come over from São Miguel in the Azores when he was 19 with one duffel bag, a cousin's address in his pocket, and the kind of stubbornness that can keep a poor man alive in a strange country for a long time. He worked on a scalloper, then a dragger, then saved enough to buy the little shop by the harbor where fishermen bought sinkers, swivels, ice, gloves, and a gallon of fuel line cleaner when the engine on an old skiff started acting up. He built the business the way he built everything else, slowly, without asking for help unless he was already out of options. By the time I was born, he'd traded the boat for the store, though he kept a 17-foot Boston whaler he called the Duas de Nos, the two of us, because he bought it the year I was born and always said it belonged to me and him together. It was the only thing he ever named in a way that sounded sentimental. My father wasn't a man who said much. He believed in work, in repetition, in checking the knot twice. Love in his house was demonstrated through what you fixed, what you paid for, what you remembered to carry without being asked. I have one sibling, my older brother Dean. Dean is 4 years older than I am, and for as long as I can remember, there was a shape to our family that I didn't understand until I was old enough to see it from the outside. Our father loved Dean, but he trusted me. Dean got the boat trips and the loud, easy affection. I got the ledger book. Dean got taken out for ice cream after helping in the shop for an hour. I got shown where the receipts lived, how to balance the inventory sheets, and how to notice when a supplier had shorted us 3 boxes of liters and thought nobody would catch it. By 14, I was doing the inventory counts on Saturday mornings by hand because I was the one who didn't lose the pencil and didn't get bored halfway through the list. Dean had the kind of personality that made strangers like him quickly. He could talk his way into the best seat at a cookout, a discount on a set of lures, and a first date with almost anybody who'd been smiling at him from across the room. What he couldn't do, not reliably, was finish anything that required him to sit still and answer to rules. He dropped out of a community college business program twice. He worked at the shop on and off, depending on whether he was getting along with my father that month. He could be charming, funny, and infuriating in the same 10-minute span. I enlisted in the Guard the week after I turned 18, went to basic at Fort Jackson, came home, and started taking classes at UMass Dartmouth while drilling 1 weekend a month. My father liked telling customers his daughter was in the Army because she knew how to keep accounts straight and handle herself in a storm. He said my brother kept the fish story straight and I kept the book straight, and everyone would laugh. Dean would laugh too, but I watched his face when he thought nobody was looking. Even then, I could tell that he hated being the butt of a joke that came with a compliment for me in it. I think often about a Sunday 5 years before my father died. He took me out on the Duas de Nos alone, the two of us, ostensibly to check a mooring line, but really I understood even then, because he wanted to talk without Dean in earshot. We were moving slowly through the harbor, the little engine thumping under our feet, gulls orbiting overhead like they were waiting for something to be thrown overboard. He asked me if I was still enjoying school. He asked whether the Army was treating me well. Then, after a long silence, he said that running a business and running a family were the same skill. At the time I thought he was just making one of his little philosophy speeches. He had a habit of doing that when he didn't want to say something directly. He'd talk about weather, engines, the price of diesel, and then somehow the subject would turn into the meaning of loyalty, or debt, or who could be trusted not to panic when money got tight. That day, he told me that both business and family required looking at what was true instead of what was comfortable. He said comfort was dangerous because it taught people to accept a lie if the lie came wrapped in familiarity. Then he said something that I didn't understand until much later. He worried that he had made Dean's life too comfortable for too long, and comfort had never once taught Dean to look at anything true if a comfortable lie was available instead. He didn't say it with anger. He sounded tired. I remember the wind coming off the water, catching the edges of his shirt, and the way his hand stayed on the wheel like he needed the boat steady in order to keep talking. Back then I thought he was being harsh. Now I think he was trying, in his awkward, indirect way, to give me a warning he hoped I would remember when the time came. By 2015, my father's health had gotten serious enough that his cardiologist put him on blood thinners after an earlier scare. He was never the kind of man to complain about his body, so if he sat us down at the kitchen table on Cove Street and said he'd had a will drawn up, everybody in the room knew it meant he had already made a private decision and was giving us the courtesy of hearing it from him first. My mother had died in 2011, so it was just the three of us when he laid it out. He was matter-of-fact, almost businesslike. The house on Cove Street and his savings would go to me because I was the one who kept coming home, stayed connected to the family, and could be trusted to keep the place together. The shop and the whaler would go to Dean because Dean had shown real interest in the marine supply business and, to be fair, had finally started putting in hours like he meant it. It wasn't a perfectly even division, and he knew it. He said so. He said fairness wasn't the same as equality. It was about continuity. He wanted the house to stay in the family line that had lived in it. He wanted the shop to remain with the child who could actually keep the shelves stocked and the customers coming back. He said it like he was talking about weatherproofing a roof. No drama, no poetry, just the terms. Then he made both of us shake his hand on it. That was very much his way. Dean didn't take it well, not in any loud way. Dean was never the sort to explode when he was actually hurt. He got quiet, he got distant, he started making little comments, at first joking and then less joking, about how Dad was rewarding me for not leaving, as if military service was some kind of hobby and not a life I'd built around discipline and obligation. I heard through my Aunt Fatima that Dean told a cousin the will was temporary, that Dad would come around once Dean proved himself with the shop. At the time I chalked it up to wounded pride. I was 26, finishing my degree, drilling, and trying to decide whether to stay in the Guard for another cycle when my mother's absence still felt fresh enough to leave a hole in every holiday. In 2024, when a deployment slot opened with the 26th Yankee Division Sustainment Task Force, I volunteered. Staying in felt like the only thing still in my life with a shape I understood. My father had a heart scare years earlier, and although he was stable, he was older now, slower, and I could hear time running under every phone call. I told myself I'd be back before anything happened. I shipped out in January of 2024 to Camp Arifjan, Kuwait, doing property accountability and distribution for a support battalion. My job was not glamorous and not especially dangerous, but it mattered. I tracked containers, generators, water bladders, forklift parts, and the 1,000 other items that keep an operation moving, even when nobody outside the wire thinks about them. There was a strange comfort in it. It was the same kind of work I'd done in my father's shop as a kid, keeping the ledger straight while things moved around me. A different uniform, same instinct. My father died on April 9, 2024. Dean called our rear detachment. The Army called the Red Cross. The Red Cross called my company commander. And one afternoon I was pulled off a supply run and told to report to the chaplain's tent, which is a walk every soldier learns to dread, long before anyone says a word. By the time I got there, the message had already come through. My father had gone into the back office of the shop after closing to count the register, the same task he'd done 6 nights a week for 3 decades, and his heart had stopped. Dean found him the next morning when he came in to open. The shock was not the part that hurt most. That came later. At first, it was just a flat, impossible silence in my head, followed by the ordinary practical thought that I needed to get home. I needed to stand near him. I needed to help with the arrangements. I needed to make sure Dean didn't get swallowed by grief and do something stupid with the business. I put in for emergency leave immediately. The paperwork moved quickly in the sense that it moved at all, which in military life still means slowly by any civilian standard. A Red Cross message, approvals up my chain of command, a flight manifest, a connection through Germany, a delay that stranded me for 36 hours, another delay because of cargo and passenger priority. I landed at Logan 8 days after my father died. The funeral had already happened. Dean had scheduled it for the 5th day at Sacred Heart in Fairhaven, with a reception afterward at the VFW Hall on Bridge Street. He told me later, on the phone before I'd even landed, that he couldn't ask a whole church full of people to sit around not knowing. His tone was careful, defensive, and exhausted, and I told myself he was grieving. Maybe he was. Maybe he was also making sure he controlled the room before I got back into it. I wasn't there to see which. I stood alone at my father's grave in Riverside Cemetery 2 days after I got home, in my dress uniform because I hadn't had time to pack anything else appropriate. The granite was cold under my hand. The grass had been cut too short and still looked stunned from the burial. I told him I was sorry I missed the funeral. I told him I would take care of the rest. I did not know yet what the rest was going to cost me. Then I went back to Kuwait to finish the deployment because that was the job and because Dean told me there was no rush on the estate stuff. His words, since nothing could really happen with probate until I was back for good anyway. I believed him. I had no reason not to. In my mind, the 2015 will was still the law of the family, a signed agreement sitting safely in a file somewhere, waiting to be opened when we were ready. I finished the deployment in October and came home to Fairhaven for good. Dean had been living in the house on Cove Street since the funeral, which struck me as odd because the 2015 will left the house to me. He framed it as practical. Someone needed to keep an eye on the pipes, the roof, the yard, the mail. I was tired and grieving and frankly relieved not to come back to an empty house, so I let it go. I told myself there would be time to sort details once I was settled. We went to see a lawyer together in November to open probate. His name was Herbert Gagnon, a solo practitioner who had done some closing work for Dean on a car loan years earlier. That should have made me suspicious. So should the fact that my father's longtime attorney, Diane Petroselli, was never mentioned. Diane had been the family lawyer in everything that mattered for as long as I could remember. She'd handled the 2015 will, the deed on the house, a small trust account my mother had left, and the shop's corporate filings. Dean said Dad had switched to someone more affordable before he died. I accepted that because I was trying to be gracious, and because I had just spent 9 months in a deployment learning not to question every messy detail in front of me. What Gagnon had on file was a will dated March 2, 2024, 5 weeks before my father died and while I was in Kuwait. It left the house on Cove Street, the shop, the whaler, and my father's savings, just over $210,000 to Dean outright. It included a sentence saying that, "My daughter Isabel has pursued a life and career separate from the family business and has been provided for previously." I read that line 4 times before it landed. My father had never once, in my entire life, talked about my service as a life separate from the family. If anything, he'd used it as proof that the family had more than one kind of strength in it. He bragged about me to customers, though he did it in his own understated way. He would say that his daughter was overseas defending the flag outside the shop. He would point to the small American decal in the front window and tell people that family was a kind of duty too. I had never been provided for previously in a way that would make him cut me out of his estate. I'd paid my own way through school, bought my own car, and spent half my adult life in uniform. If he had wanted to leave me less, he would have said so directly. Then I looked at the signature. It was my father's name. It looked close enough that a stranger might not have blinked. But I knew the pressure in the last stroke was wrong. I knew the way he formed his J. I knew he always dragged the pen a fraction too long through the first loop of the Q in Joachim, because he had learned to sign his name in 2 languages and never fully standardized either one. I knew the tiny hook he made on the final mem when he was tired. This signature had none of the little hesitations I knew from 1,000 bank forms and shop receipts. It was copied with care, not written with ownership. And beneath the signature in the witness line was my name. I was sitting in Herbert Gagnon's small waiting room with a photocopy of the page in my hand and looking at Isabel Amaral in handwriting close enough to mine that a stranger wouldn't immediately question it. But on March 2, 2024, I was at Camp Arifjan, Kuwait, 7,000 miles away, handling a battalion inventory under a federal duty status. I had not signed that page. I could not have signed that page. Any record in the Army, the defense travel system, the leave database, or the daily accountability sheets would prove exactly where I was. The person who forged my name onto it had either not thought of that or had assumed nobody would ever check. The strange thing about betrayal is how quickly it becomes administrative. Once the initial shock wore off, I started doing what I always do when something breaks. I made a list. I did not confront Dean. Not then. I did not storm into his house or call him screaming or tell him what I had found. 9 months in Kuwait had taught me one useful thing that applied directly to civilian life. Never report a discrepancy until you have counted it twice yourself and know exactly what you're going to say happened to it. So I did what any good supply sergeant would do. I started building a paper trail. I spent the first week back sleeping badly, eating too much coffee, and pretending to everyone in the family that I was just overwhelmed by grief and jet lag. I let Dean keep talking. I let him ask, too casually, whether I'd had a chance to look everything over. I let him explain that probate could be complicated and that Gagnon would take care of it. The more he spoke, the more careful I became. People who are lying often talk as if they are helping you understand. If you listen long enough, they reveal what they're worried you might notice. I drove to Boston one morning under the pretense of meeting a friend from Basic and sat in the legal assistance office at Hanscom Air Force Base with a captain named Reyes. She specialized in wills and estates for service members. I told her my situation without drama, just the facts. My father died while I was deployed. A new will appeared, and my signature was on it. She asked for dates. I gave her dates. She asked where I had physically been on March 2nd. I told her. She leaned back in her chair and said, in the driest possible tone, that the Army had already done half the proof for me. Reyes helped me request certified copies of my leave and pass records, my unit's daily personnel accountability reports, and a sworn statement from my company commander confirming that I had been continuously present at Camp Arifjan from January until emergency leave in April. She explained which records would be easiest to authenticate and which should be backed by a custodian certification. To anyone else, it might have sounded tedious. To me, it sounded like relief. My life had been logged by other people every single day. It turned out that, if someone forged my presence in Massachusetts, they were forging against one of the most over-documented alibis imaginable. The harder part was finding Diane Petroselli, the lawyer who had actually drafted my father's 2015 will. Her office was still on Union Street in New Bedford. I called, introduced myself, and explained why I was asking. There was a pause long enough to tell me this was not news to her, at least not entirely. Then she said, carefully, that she had drafted my father's will in 2015 and that he had called her office in February of 2024 to ask about updating it. He never made it back in. He died 5 weeks later. That told me two important things. First, the March 2nd will was not only suspicious, it was incompatible with the timeline Diane had in her file. Second, my father had not, as Dean claimed, quietly switched lawyers and cut me out before he died. He had reached out to his old lawyer to make changes shortly before his death. Whatever was in that change request, Dean had not been supposed to own the result of it. Diane pulled her file for me, and when I saw the original 2015 will in black and white, with my father's genuine signature notarized in her own office and witnessed by her paralegal and office manager, I felt the first hard certainty in days. The 2015 document matched everything my father had told us at the kitchen table. It matched what he'd said on the boat. It matched the way he lived. He wanted the house to go to me and the shop and whaler to go to Dean. He had not, in fact, changed his mind. Diane put me in touch with a forensic document examiner named Priscilla Farrow, who worked out of Providence. Priscilla did not talk like a television expert. She talked like somebody who had spent years learning how paper and ink betray liars slowly and with patience. She asked for scans, originals if possible, comparison signatures, anything from banks, town clerk records, tax forms, the shop ledger if it existed. I gave her what I had and what Diane could supply. Her report came back with language I would later memorize, because it was the kind of language you want on your side if you're trying to prove a fraud in probate court. The March 2024 signature on the will showed inconsistent pen pressure, unstable line quality, and a tremor pattern not consistent with the rest of the sample set. Those findings were consistent with either a traced forgery or a signature obtained under physical duress from a man 5 weeks from a fatal cardiac event. She also examined my supposed witness signature and told me something I hadn't expected to need explained. Whoever copied my name had clearly worked from an old photograph or a document with my handwriting on it. The pen strokes showed hesitation in the exact places where a person copying a shape will stop to think, not in the places where a person signing their own name would naturally speed up. My signature was not especially elegant. It was fast, practiced, military neat. The copied version had the look of someone trying to remember how a letter connected by muscle memory rather than actually having that muscle memory themselves. That should have been enough to convict somebody in my mind. It wasn't. The final piece was the notary block. Grace Sylvia, the notary listed on the March will, was real. She was licensed. She was also, as public business filings eventually showed, Dean's girlfriend of the past 2 years. I had not known that. My father had not known that, if he ever saw her name at all. Dean had never once mentioned it to me. It appeared nowhere in Gagnon's file. When Diane's investigator, a retired New Bedford police detective named Manny Souza, reached out to Grace, he didn't start by accusing her of anything. He explained the problem plainly. A soldier's deployment records placed me in Kuwait on the date the will claimed I had witnessed it in New Bedford. That meant the document, as written, was impossible. Either the date was false, the signature was false, the witness line was false, or all three were. If Grace had notarized it, she needed to understand exactly what she'd been pulled into. Grace did not hold up long. She gave Manny a recorded statement saying Dean had brought her the will already signed and told her it just needed the notary part finished. She said she had notarized it without either me or my father being present, trusting her boyfriend's word that everything about it was proper. She said she hadn't known it was illegal to notarize a signature she hadn't personally witnessed being made. Ignorance of that rule is common enough that people like Manny see it all the time. It is almost never a defense, but her willingness to say it on the record, once she understood what had happened, changed the case. It meant we weren't building a theory out of circumstantial annoyance. We were building a fraud case out of a confession. Diane filed the will contest in Bristol County Probate and Family Court in January, attaching my military records, her own 2015 file, Priscilla's forensic report, and Grace Sylvia's statement. Dean, through Gagnon, initially fought it. He argued that the March will reflected our father's final true wishes. That position lasted exactly as long as it took the judge to look at the deployment records and ask how a document signed on March 2nd could bear the witness signature of a soldier stationed in Kuwait on that date. Gagnon had no answer, because Dean, it turned out, had not told his own attorney about the deployment records at all. He had apparently hoped the estate would settle quietly before anyone thought to check whether a woman in a plywood tent in Kuwait had somehow signed a Massachusetts probate document in person. While all of this was happening, I had to keep living in the middle of it. That is the part people don't always understand. There was no clean break. I still had to call suppliers, make sure my father's bills got paid, answer cousins, sort the house keys, and deal with the practical fact that grief does not stop because fraud begins. Some days I would sit at the kitchen table on Cove Street with 3 different sets of paper in front of me, tax documents, military records, and old receipts from the shop, and I would feel as though I were trying to reconcile 3 different versions of the same family. The probate hearing itself was quieter than I expected a courtroom to be. There were no gasps, no dramatic interruptions, no one slamming a palm against a table and confessing at the sight of evidence. Just Judge Almeida, moving through the exhibits with unhurried precision, and the sterile sound of pages turning. My hands were cold the entire time. When I testified, I spoke for maybe 20 minutes. I walked through the deployment timeline, January departure, monthly accountability reports, the continuity of my presence at Arifjan, the emergency leave triggered by my father's death, the delayed flight back through Germany. I explained where I was physically on March 2, 2024. I explained that I could not have been in New Bedford, could not have witnessed a document, and could not have signed my name on a piece of paper I had never seen. The judge looked down at my DA Form 31, then up at me, and asked whether I had any explanation for how my signature appeared on the will. I said, "No, Your Honor, I don't, because I wasn't there and I didn't sign it." It was the simplest true sentence I said in the entire proceeding, and somehow it was the one that seemed to matter most. Dean did not testify. Gagnon had advised him against it once it became clear that cross-examination would force him to explain Grace Sylvia's statement and the gap between the claimed execution of the will and my documented deployment status. I watched my brother sit at the respondent's table for 2 full days saying almost nothing. That silence, more than any argument, told me how badly he had misjudged his position. He had counted on the paper not being checked too closely. He had counted on my being too far away and too exhausted to fight. He had counted on the emotional fact of our father's death, drowning out the practical fact of who signed what, when, and where. He was wrong. When Judge Almeida issued the findings, he ruled the March 2024 will invalid due to fraud and lack of proper execution. The 2015 will was admitted to probate. The house on Cove Street came to me, exactly as my father had intended. The shop and the whaler went to Dean under the valid will, not because he deserved them after what he had done, but because my father had chosen that division, and the court respected the choice that had actually been made while he was alive and competent. There was a strange cold justice in that. Dean had risked everything trying to take the one thing he was not supposed to have, and in the end he kept the one thing he would have been given anyway if he'd left the rest alone. The criminal referral came next. The Bristol County District Attorney's Office took up the case once the probate findings entered the record. Dean was charged with forgery, uttering a forged instrument, and notary fraud as a co-conspirator alongside Grace, who cooperated fully once the law caught up to the personal consequences of what she'd done. Her cooperation and the fact that she had been misled, at least in part, by her relationship with Dean, resulted in a lighter disposition for her than for him. Dean pleaded guilty 11 months later rather than face a jury with a forensic examiner, a named attorney, the Army's records, and a former detective, all pointing at the same forged signature. He received 2 years, suspended to probation because he had no prior record, plus restitution and a permanent bar, under the terms of the plea, from ever contesting the validity of the 2015 will again. It was not the sort of punishment that makes for dramatic satisfaction. There was no march to a cell block, no cinematic collapse. Just a sentence, a file, and a very public record of what he had tried to do. My Aunt Fatima became the person I leaned on most during all of it. She was my father's younger sister and the only living relative who had known both my father and Dean well enough, for long enough to help me understand the shape of the damage without either of us having to pretend surprise. One evening, over coffee at her kitchen table in Fairhaven, she told me she had warned my father years earlier that Dean's resentment over the 2015 division wasn't the kind that fades. It was the kind that waits. She said he had waved her off, convinced that blood and a handshake agreement would hold. She didn't say "I told you so." She genuinely didn't want to be right. Instead, she sat with me and pulled out old photographs of the shop, the boat, my parents' wedding, and my father lifting a box of squid bait with the ease of a much younger man. We laid the pictures out one by one and rebuilt, from paper and memory, a version of my father that Dean's forged sentence had briefly tried to overwrite. That was its own kind of violence, I think. Not just the theft of money or property. It was the attempt to edit a dead man's last words, so that his own daughter would have to wonder whether he'd secretly judged her unworthy. The forged line about my having pursued a life separate from the family was the detail that angered me most, because it was the easiest lie to tell someone far away. It relied on distance. It relied on the assumption that service in uniform would make me feel detached from the life at home. It was written by someone who believed that if I was overseas I would not notice the insult embedded in it until too late. I noticed. The house on Cove Street came to me. The probate court ordered Dean out and he left without a fight, moving in with Grace's family in Westport. From what I know through my aunt, that relationship did not survive the year. I can't say that surprised me. Marriages and partnerships built on convenience and shared risk tend to collapse once the risk becomes public record. The shop and the whaler remained in Dean's hands under the valid will. That detail still sits strangely with me. He had the real inheritance right there. He had the business our father had actually intended him to have. He didn't need to forge anything to keep it. But resentment rarely wants enough. It wants more than the other person. It wants proof that the pain was real, that the score has been settled by force rather than trust. Dean gambled all of that trying to take my piece too. People sometimes ask whether I feel guilty about what happened to him. Prison, probation, the broken relationship with the woman who helped him cover it up, the family fracture that followed. I've turned that question over more times than I can count, usually sitting out on the water past Pope's Island on a Sunday morning when the harbor is quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. The honest answer is that guilt isn't the right word. I feel grief, mostly, for a version of my brother that existed before resentment curdled into forgery. I remember the boy who let me ride in the bow of the whaler when we were kids, the one who taught me how to toss a line without tangling my wrist, the one who could make my father laugh just by pretending to be more confident than he was. I think Dean spent 30 years believing love and inheritance were the same currency, and that if I had more of one, he needed more of the other to feel even. I think he decided that because Dad had trusted me with the house and him with the shop, he had somehow been shortchanged. Instead of asking for the truth, he manufactured one. I still don't fully know how to carry that. Diane Petroselli waived a good portion of her fee once the case resolved. When I tried to argue with her about the invoice, she told me that representing the daughter of a man who had brought her office fresh scallops for 11 straight years wasn't really about the billable hours by the time it got to a courtroom. I tried to thank her, and she waved me off in the same plain way my father used to when someone praised him for doing what he considered merely correct. Captain Reyes, back at Hanscom, later told me my case had become something of an informal teaching example in the legal assistance office, proof that a deployment isn't just time lost from home, but also, accidentally, one of the most thoroughly documented alibis a person could ever ask for if it ever comes to that. I hope no one else who hears this story ever needs that particular comfort. But I'm glad it was there when I did. I still keep the duas de nos at a slip in Fairhaven. Technically, it was part of the mess for a while, because the fraudulent will had tried to move it around. But in the end, Dean texted me one line that said, "Take the boat, Tiz, I can't look at it." That text came after everything had already broken open, after the probate filing, after Grace's statement, after the first hearing. It was the only thing he did in the entire ordeal without a lawyer in the loop. No strategy, no spin, just a sentence from a man who suddenly could not bear to look at the object that had once been our father's favorite small happiness. I take the boat out most Sundays when I'm not drilling. I run it past Pope's Island, past the spot where the shop still sits. The business survives under a new manager Dean hired during the mess, operating under a lease-to-own arrangement Diane helped structure, so our father's name would stay on the sign, even if the circumstances around it changed. I don't know whether that matters to the customers as much as it matters to me, but it matters. It keeps something intact. Sometimes, out on the water, I think about the version of my father who called the lawyer's office 5 weeks before he died to update his will and never made it back in time. I think about the line Dean tried to insert in his place, the one that suggested I'd gone off and built a life separate from the family. I think about how hard my father worked to keep 1 foot in the old country and 1 foot in Massachusetts, to give both of his children something steady, even when he couldn't give us the same things. I like to believe that whatever he intended to change that day, it wasn't this. If he had lived long enough to sign the update, maybe he would have made a different decision. I can't know that. No one can. But I do know he had already called his lawyer. I do know he was still thinking about the future. I do know he had not forgotten me. And I do know that the document Dean used to cut me out was built on a lie layered over a dead man's name and a soldier's deployment record. That part is not guesswork. That part is in writing. There are people who think family disputes are really about money. Sometimes they are. More often, they are about who gets to define the story after the person who held the story together is gone. My brother tried to rewrite ours while I was overseas, trusting that distance, grief, and the dull machinery of probate would do the work for him. He was wrong about all 3. My father taught me, long before any of this happened, to look at what was true instead of what was comfortable. That turned out to be the only inheritance I could count on without a signature. It also turned out to be the thing that saved me. That betrayal changed my life, but it did not get the final word. The truth did.